He was just walking home after filming when a single trembling note from a violin froze Keanu Reeves in his tracks. In a dark Portland alley, an old man played a song no one else could hear, a song carrying a lifetime of pain. Keanu stepped closer, only to discover a secret that would change both of their lives forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The night had settled over Portland's Old Town with a quiet heaviness, the kind that made every sound echo a little too far and every shadow stretch a little too long. Keanu Reeves stepped out of the small production warehouse where the crew had wrapped late, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders. Hours of filming left him tired, but it was the peaceful kind of tired that usually came with a long walk home. The streets were nearly empty now. The restaurants had closed, the bars were quieting, and the street vendors had packed up hours ago. The city seemed to breathe out one long, cold sigh as the temperature dipped. Keanu zipped up his coat, feeling the bite of the night air against his neck. His breath rose in thin white clouds as he walked past the old brick buildings that lined the street, their windows glowing faintly with the last traces of life inside. He liked walking alone after filming. It reminded him of every quiet moment he'd clung to, growing up moments where he could hear his own thoughts instead of the chaos of cameras and voices. Tonight felt no different at first. He kept a steady pace, listening to the faint hum of a neon sign flickering across the street, and the distant sound of a car turning somewhere, blocks away. It was peaceful, almost soothing until something changed. A faint sound drifted across the stillness, so soft at first that Keanu thought it might just be a trick of the wind. But a few steps later, it returned. A single melodic line, a trembling note drawn from a violin. Keanu stopped walking. He turned his head, trying to trace where the sound came from. It wasn't music you'd hear from a bar or a street performer. It was too fragile, too private, almost as if it had been pulled straight out of someone's chest. He took another slow step, listening harder. The music floated from somewhere down the block, tucked deep in the mouth of a narrow alley between two run-down buildings. A soft, wavering tone, stretching into something that sounded like the beginning of a confession. It was mournful, delicate, and aching with old memories. And in the quiet of the night, it felt strangely alive. Keanu felt the sound settling into him, drawing him forward before he even made the conscious decision to move. There was something raw in that melody, something so personal that it didn't feel like it belonged to the open air. It felt like the kind of music someone played when they believed no one was listening. And maybe no one had been until now. He took a slow breath, letting the sound guide him. The violin's voice wavered again, the pitch cracking mid-note, as though the musician's hand had faltered. A sharp ache moved behind Keanu's ribs. Whoever was playing wasn't just performing. They were releasing something. He stepped closer to the mouth of the alley. The shadows deepened there, broken only by the dim glow of a single streetlight flickering overhead. The music floated out again, fuller this time, trying to rise but weighed down by something heavy. Keanu stood completely still, the cold pressed through his coat. His fingers stiffened, his breath condensed in front of him, but he didn't move. That melody held him in place. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't strong, it wasn't even steady, but it was honest, painfully honest. It carried a lifetime's worth of quiet heartbreak threaded through every shaky note. And standing there alone on a silent Portland street, Keanu felt it as clearly as if the emotion were his own. The violin suddenly faltered again, the sound breaking off mid-phrase, as though the musician had run out of strength. The silence that followed hit harder than the music. Keanu felt something shift inside him, a pull gentle, but certain, like a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. He didn't know who was playing or what story lay behind that trembling melody, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to find out. Keanu stepped deeper into the alley, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The weak street lamp above flickered once, then steadied just enough to reveal the narrow passage. The brick walls on either side were worn and discolored, marked by years of rain and forgotten footsteps. A cold draft funneled through the space, carrying with it the faint smell of damp concrete and old wood. But beneath all of that, he heard it again, the violin. Softer now, more hesitant, as if the musician was unsure whether to continue or give up entirely. Keanu slowed his breathing, not wanting to disturb the sound. His boots made almost no noise on the gritty concrete. He followed the trembling trail of music until the alley widened into a small open corner between two connected buildings. That was where he finally saw the source. A lone figure sat on an overturned crate, shoulders hunched against the cold, a violin tucked beneath his chin. The man was thin, almost fragile-looking under the oversized coat draped around him. His hair, silver and thinning, peeked out beneath a wool cap that had clearly seen better days. His cheeks were sunken and his hands shook, not from fear, but from something far more permanent. The bow trembled as it slid across the strings. The man's left hand twitched, struggling with the positions. It was clear he wasn't fully in control of the movement, yet he forced the notes out anyway. The sound wavered between heartbreak and beauty, landing somewhere painfully honest in between. His eyes weren't open. He wasn't looking for an audience. He was lost in whatever memories he carried, playing for someone no longer there. Keanu watched quietly, understanding without words that this was not performance. This was a man reaching for a life he had once lived. The melody broke again. The bow slipped with a sharp scrape that echoed against the alley walls. The old man winced, lowering the violin just enough to let out a frustrated breath. His hand spasmed, rubbing his wrist in a motion that looked both practiced and defeated. That was when he noticed Keanu standing a few steps away. Their eyes met, one filled with surprise and embarrassment, the other with silent empathy. The old man cleared his throat, trying to hide his discomfort. "Didn't think anyone was out this late," he said quietly. His voice had a soft, accented tone, carrying traces of another country. His gaze drifted to the violin as though worried he had disturbed someone with his playing. Keanu took a step closer, careful and respectful. "I heard your music," he said gently. "I stopped because it moved me." The old man blinked, confused. He shifted on the crate, glancing down the alley as if expecting someone else. "You heard that," he asked, almost disbelieving. "Most people walk past. They don't hear anything." "I heard every note," Keanu answered, and he meant it. The old man looked at the violin in his lap, holding it as though it were both precious and painful. "It isn't what it used to be," he admitted. "My hand doesn't listen anymore." He tried to laugh, but it came out tired, his eyes lowered, shadowed by a quiet sadness. "But sometimes I play anyway, just so I don't forget." The cold seeped through the alley, but Keanu didn't feel it anymore. Not compared to the heaviness in the man's voice. He could tell that the music wasn't just a habit, it was survival. It was memory. It was the last thread connecting the man to a life that had slipped away. Keanu stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away. "Would you?" He hesitated, choosing the words carefully, "play one more song." The old man stared at him, stunned, as though no one had spoken those words to him in years. The old man held the violin a little tighter, as if steadying his heart instead of his hands. A faint smile touched his lips, surprised and fragile. "No one has asked me that in a very long time," he whispered. Keanu nodded, waiting without pressure, giving the man space to choose. After a shaky breath, the bow lifted again. The first note trembled, almost breaking, but it carried something real, something lived. Standing there, in this cold alley, Keanu felt the moment settle around them, a quiet connection forming in the darkness, born from a song almost forgotten. The last trembling note faded into the alley's cold air, drifting upward until it disappeared into the night. Keanu stood in place for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him. The old man lowered the violin slowly, the bow hand trembling, as though the simple act of holding it had taken everything out of him. The street lamp above flickered again, its weak glow barely reaching the narrow corner where the musician sat. Shadows clung to the man's face, but even in the dim light, Keanu could see the exhaustion etched into every line. He took one careful step forward, making sure not to startle him. The man looked up sharply, his eyes widening at the sight of someone still standing there. Most people would have passed by without a glance. Most people had. His expression flickered between surprise, embarrassment, and disbelief. He adjusted his coat, as if to make himself look more composed, though the fabric was too thin to do much against the cold. The coat hung off his shoulders like a garment, several sizes too big, giving him an even more fragile appearance. The chill in the alley made his breath unsteady. His fingers twitched with small spasms that he tried to hide but couldn't fully control. Keanu stayed where he was, close enough to show interest, but far enough not to intrude. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly. "Your music, it stopped me in my tracks." The man blinked, studying him as if trying to determine whether the comment was sincere or simply polite. The night wind tugged at his thinning hair beneath the worn wool cap he wore. His lips pressed into a small line before he let out a breath that sounded tired and uncertain. You heard that the man asked, almost whispering. The question carried weight, as if the idea of being heard at all felt foreign. Keanu nodded. Every note he answered. It was beautiful, honest. I wanted to hear more. The man let out a soft, broken laugh. Not mocking, just surprised. Beautiful, he repeated, tasting the word like it was something distant. His gaze dropped to the violin resting in his hands. The wood was old, scratched in places, worn smooth in others. The bow hair was frayed at the edges. It was clear this instrument had lived a long life beside him. He tried lifting the violin again, but his left hand twitched sharply, forcing him to stop. His expression tightened with frustration. "My arm doesn't listen anymore," he murmured. "Happens every time I try to shift." Keanu noticed the faint tremor in his forearm, the small spasms that disrupted the fluidity a violinist depended on. The man repositioned his fingers with effort, but they refused to obey with the precision they once must have had. "Used to play all night without feeling a thing," he said, voice soft. Now the bow moves faster than my hand can think." Keanu took a slow, careful step closer. "It still sounded like it came from someplace real," he said, "like it mattered." The man looked up again, and this time his eyes softened, touched by something fragile. "You're kind," he whispered. "Too kind for an old ghost like me." Keanu shook his head gently. "Not a ghost, a musician." For the first time, a real smile flickered across the man's face, small, thin, but undeniably there. He lifted the violin again, not to play, but to hold it closer, as if reassured by hearing someone call him what he once was and still wanted to be. The old man shifted slightly on the overturned crate, adjusting his posture in a way that suggested he was trying to look more composed than he felt. The cold seeped through every seam of his coat, making his shoulders curl inward. Keanu noticed the way the man's fingers hovered over the strings, hesitant, almost afraid of betraying him again. The tremor in his hand wasn't constant, but when it hit, it struck with an unmistakable finality. A musician could hide many weaknesses, but not that one. Not the one that stole precision and control, not the one that made a man question whether the art he lived for still belonged to him. Keanu approached carefully, giving the man time to adjust to his presence. He didn't want to overwhelm him or make him uncomfortable. When he reached a respectful distance, he lowered himself onto an empty crate beside him. The crate creaked under the shift of weight, but it felt steady enough. The cold from the metal seeped through his clothes, but he didn't mind. He was here for a reason. He could feel it. "I'm sorry," the man said after a moment, eyes still lowered. "I shouldn't have played that poorly with someone listening." His tone wasn't defensive. It was defeated, burdened by years of feeling lesser. "I wasn't always like this," he added, almost as if apologizing for his own body. "Once, I could make this violin sing." "I believe you," Keanu said, and he meant it. There was too much emotion in those notes for it to come from someone who had never known mastery. The man lifted his gaze, searching his face, as if trying to decide whether he was being humored. But Keanu's expression remained steady, open, and sincere. The man sighed, warming his fingers against the violin's old wooden body. "My name is Elias," he finally said. "Elias Roth." Keanu repeated the name softly, letting it settle into the space between them. "I'm Keanu," he offered in return, though from the flicker in Elias's eyes, he suspected the old man already knew. But Elias didn't comment on it. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if accepting the introduction on equal ground. Elias adjusted his grip on the bow again. "I used to play in a small orchestra," he said. "Nothing big, nothing famous. But it was my life." He swallowed hard. "Then I had a small stroke. Only a moment." He tapped his left arm lightly, but it was enough to take this from me. His voice wavered, carrying years of buried grief. "They said I couldn't keep up anymore. Said I was unreliable, outdated." The word hung in the air like a wound reopened. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. "That must have been incredibly hard," he said. Elias nodded. "You work your whole life for something," he whispered, "and in one moment you're told you don't belong in it anymore." His breath trembled as he looked down at his hands. "So I stopped performing. Didn't see the point, but I couldn't stop playing entirely. So now I play here, where the only person I can disappoint is myself." The confession settled deeply in the cold alley, each word carrying the weight of years spent in solitude. Keanu looked at the violin resting in Elias's lap, then back at the man who held it like a lifeline. The dim streetlight glinted off the strings, casting a faint, trembling reflection on Elias's fingers. Keanu leaned in just slightly. "Would you let me hear one more piece?" he asked gently. "Only if you want to." Elias froze, breath-catching. That simple request struck him harder than the cold ever could. Elias stared at Keanu with an expression that hovered between disbelief and vulnerability, as if the question itself had reached into a part of him he had sealed away. His fingers curled gently around the violin's neck, and he shook his head once, before nodding slowly, almost unconsciously. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "My hand. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it doesn't." Keanu waited steady and patient. Elias lifted the bow slightly, letting the horsehair brush the strings without pressure. The faintest sound hummed between them, fragile but alive. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath, gathering courage from somewhere deep within the memories the violin still held. When he opened them again, there was a glimmer of something new. Not confidence, but longing. A desire to believe he still had one song worth giving. "No one has asked to hear me in years," he murmured. "Not truly hear me." Keanu nodded, the cold forgotten, as he leaned forward. "I'm here now," he said quietly. Elias raised the violin to his shoulder, trembling but resolute. The bow hovered, waiting for his hands to agree with his heart. And in that small, silent moment, something inside him awakened. The morning light crept slowly across Portland, brushing pale gold over the rooftops and windows of the older neighborhoods. Keanu made his way toward Elias's building, a quiet determination guiding each step. The night before had left a lingering weight on his chest, a mix of sorrow and something he couldn't yet name. Elias's music had been fragile but alive, and the man behind it was even more so. Keanu felt drawn back, wanting to understand the life behind that trembling melody. The building where Elias lived stood on a narrow residential street, its faded paint peeling from years of winter rain and neglect. The front steps sagged slightly and the railing wobbled when Keanu placed a hand on it. He climbed the stairs carefully, noticing the chipped numbers on the doors and the faint smell of old wood that always seemed to cling to places time had forgotten. When he knocked gently on Elias's door, there was a moment of silence before the sound of slow, uneven footsteps approached. The door opened just wide enough for Elias to peek through. When he saw Keanu, his eyes widened in surprise, not because he didn't expect a visitor, but because he didn't expect someone to come back. For a moment, he simply stared, unsure of what to say. Then he stepped aside, allowing Keanu inside with a hesitant gesture. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A single narrow bed sat against the wall, its blanket neatly folded. A cracked window let in a draft of cold air rattling slightly in its frame. On a tiny table lay a handful of old photographs, their edges curling. Some showed Elias much younger, dressed in performance attire, standing proudly with an orchestra behind him. Others captured moments with musicians whose faces had faded into history. A violin case rested beneath the window, worn from decades of use. "I didn't expect company," Elias said, trying to smile as he shuffled toward a small kitchenette. His hands shook as he reached for a kettle, filling it slowly from the tap. "I don't get many knockings on my door these days." He set the kettle on the stove with practiced care, though his fingers trembled more than he seemed willing to show. Keanu took a seat at the small table, watching Elias move around the kitchen with a gentleness shaped by years of living alone. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said. "Last night, your music stayed with me." Elias paused, leaning against the counter for support. "My music," he repeated the words soft and distant. "Once it was everything." He turned slightly so Keanu could see his profile, the lines etched deep across his forehead and cheeks. "But life has a way of moving forward, even when you stay behind." When the kettle began to heat, Elias reached for 2 cups, mismatched and chipped at the rims. As he poured hot water over the tea leaves, his hands trembled again. The tea splashed slightly onto the counter, but he ignored it, focused instead on keeping his movements steady. He carried the cups to the table with slow, deliberate steps. Keanu accepted his cup with a quiet thank you, noticing how Elias's breath seemed to hitch from the effort. "How long have you lived here?" Keanu asked gently. "About 15 years, Elias answered. "Moved here after things changed." Elias sat across from Keanu, hands wrapped around the warm cup, as if drawing strength from it. His eyes drifted to the cracked window, where the morning light cast a thin, wavering line across the floorboards. "Before I came here," he said slowly, "I traveled everywhere. Little towns, small concert halls, places where the people listened with their hearts, not their eyes." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Eastern Europe was home for me for a long time. I wasn't famous, but I was respected. That was enough." He paused as though searching for the right words. "When I moved to the United States, I thought I would continue performing. There were orchestras that needed players, opportunities." His voice softened, becoming almost fragile. "But life doesn't always follow the path you think it will." He lifted his trembling left hand, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. "One morning years ago, I was coming up from the subway. Someone slipped. They fell into me. I hit the railing, hard." His fingers curled in memory of the impact. "I didn't think much of it at first. It hurt, but everything heals." "Yes." He let out a hollow laugh. "I didn't know that a tiny stroke had followed soon after." Keanu listened quietly, absorbing every detail. Elias's voice carried a depth that came only from living through something silently, with no one beside you to witness the pain. Elias continued, "My arm changed. It twitched. It cramped. And the orchestras, well, they don't want someone who might falter on stage." His gaze dropped. "They said I was outdated, that younger musicians were waiting. Stronger, faster, more reliable." He tried to smile, but the effort only revealed the sadness behind it. "I lost everything in a month," Elias whispered. "One minute I had a life full of music. The next I was told to step aside." He took a slow sip of his tea, his hand shaking slightly. "I tried teaching for a while, worked with a few students. But lessons cost money, and families wanted teachers who could demonstrate perfectly." His shoulders slumped, so the students faded away, one by one. He set the cup down gently, as if afraid it might shatter. "For years, the only music I played was here, in this little room, late at night when the world was quiet enough to pretend I was still on stage." His eyes softened at the memory. "I always told myself I'd perform one last time, just once more, end things on my terms. But that dream?" He gestured around the room. "Dreams don't fit well in places like this." Keanu felt the words settle heavily in the air. He glanced at the old photographs again, the younger Elias standing proudly with his violin, surrounded by musicians who had long moved on or disappeared. The contrast between the vibrant man in the photos and the quiet, trembling figure before him made the moment even more poignant. Elias let out a quiet breath. "I didn't think anyone cared to hear me anymore," he said softly. "Not with this hand, not with this old body." He lifted his gaze, meeting Keanu's eyes with a mixture of vulnerability and hope he seemed afraid to acknowledge. "But last night, when you stopped, when you listened, I felt something I haven't felt in years." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "You still have music in you, Elias," he said. "I heard it." The words hung in the room like a small warmth, pushing back the cold that had settled around Elias's life for so long. Elias looked down at his hands, turning them palm up as though searching for the strength that had slipped away over the years. The morning light from the cracked window outlined the faint tremor that never fully left him. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to imagine the applause. Not for fame, just for the feeling of giving people something beautiful, something that made them forget their troubles for a moment." His lips lifted into a faint smile. Music can soften even the hardest days. It softened mine. He reached for one of the old photographs on the table. It showed him standing before a small orchestra, younger, confident eyes lifted toward the audience, as if he believed the world was bigger than his struggles. He traced the corner of the picture with a slow finger. "That was the last concert before the accident," he murmured. "I thought it was only the beginning." He looked up at Keanu with a fragile honesty. Instead, it became the ending. Keanu held his gaze with a steady calm. Elias sensed no pity, only genuine understanding. That alone seemed to give him the courage to continue. "I always hoped I'd get one invitation," Elias said. "Just one chance to stand on a stage again, to feel the lights, to play a piece that mattered." His voice softened to a whisper. "Before my hands give out completely." He set the photograph down and folded his trembling fingers together. "But no one invites an old man with a damaged arm. People forget you exist. They walk past you on the street and don't even see you." His throat tightened with the weight of unspoken years. "It's lonely, Keanu, truly lonely." Keanu leaned in slightly, his expression warm. "I see you, Elias," he said gently, "and I'm listening." The sky had already darkened by the time Keanu reached his home, the evening settling into a deep quiet that matched the heaviness he carried. He slipped off his coat and hung it by the door, but the cold from outside seemed to follow him in, lingering around his shoulders like a reminder of the night before. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. Then he walked into the kitchen, switched on a small lamp, and sat down at the worn wooden table that had seen countless late nights of reflection. Tonight, his thoughts were not on work or scripts or the noise of the day. They were on Elias. The fading melody from the alley seemed to echo inside him, haunting and unfinished. It wasn't just the music itself, but the way Elias had played it, pouring everything he had left into each trembling note. It carried the weight of a lifetime, the ache of being forgotten, and the faint spark of a man who still held on to a dream no one seemed to care about anymore. Keanu exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together to warm them. He felt something tightening in his chest, a mixture of empathy, sadness, and a quiet urgency he couldn't ignore. He thought about all the people he'd met in his life who had slipped through the cracks, people with good hearts who had been pushed aside or overlooked, people whose art talent or spirit had dimmed because the world had stopped listening. He had seen it in the streets he walked, in the stories he had lived, even in his own past. Loss wasn't new to him. Hardship wasn't foreign. And resilience was something he understood deeply. Elias reminded him of the fragility that comes with age and loneliness, but he also reminded him of something else, the way small acts of kindness had once shaped his own life, in moments when he needed them most. Keanu leaned back in his chair, staring at the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. He remembered being young, struggling unheard. He remembered the teachers, mentors, and strangers who had offered encouragement when he barely had the strength to keep going. Their gestures were small in the moment, but unforgettable in the long run. A hand on his shoulder, a quiet belief in his potential, a moment of being seen. These memories rose within him like soft echoes, guiding him toward a decision he hadn't fully formed yet, but could already feel taking shape. Elias deserved a final stage, not because he was owed anything by the world, not because of fame or recognition, but because he had carried music inside him his whole life, and all he wanted was one last opportunity to share it. His body had weakened, his circumstances had shrunk, but his spirit, though shaken, had not died. Keanu saw that clearly, and he felt an undeniable pull to help him reclaim that piece of himself. The idea came slowly at first, almost like a whisper. Record him. Capture his music. Share it with someone who might understand its value. Keanu tapped lightly on the table as the thought deepened. It didn't need to be a grand production. It didn't need to involve lights or crowds or attention. What Elias needed was a chance, a bridge between his past and the one moment he still longed for. A moment that could be given quietly, respectfully, without putting him in the spotlight before he was ready. As he sat in the stillness of his kitchen, the decision began to solidify. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. Keanu rose from the table and walked slowly across the living room, letting the familiar quiet of his home settle around him. The idea was no longer a whisper. It was clear, steady, and warm, the way a good intention always began. He reached for his phone, hesitated for a moment, then opened a search window. He typed in the name of a platform he had come across years ago, a place known for uplifting overlooked artists and forgotten talents. America's most inspiring musicians. It wasn't flashy and it didn't cater to popularity. It existed to spotlight stories that meant something, stories like Elias's. He scrolled through their page-reading submission guidelines and watching a few of their featured videos. They highlighted street performers who had fallen through the cracks, retired musicians who had once played for crowds but now played only for themselves, individuals whose stories were more powerful than their fame. As Keanu watched one short clip of a woman in her 70s singing with a voice cracked by time but full of heart, something inside him clicked. This was the place. This was where Elias's music belonged, not for views, not for attention, but for dignity, for recognition, for one last bow. He closed the page and walked into his small office, scanning the room for equipment. He didn't need a film crew or a production setup. He wanted the recording to feel intimate, honest, and real. His eyes landed on a small tripod leaning against a shelf. He picked it up, testing its weight. Then, he reached for a professional microphone tucked in a drawer, something he rarely used but kept for personal projects. He examined the cord, checking for frayed edges or dust. Everything still worked perfectly, simple and pure, exactly what he needed. He placed the equipment on the desk, but he didn't start packing it yet. Instead, he sat down and thought again about Elias, the trembling hands, the fading confidence, the quiet yearning that had never fully died. He pictured Elias playing in that cold alley again, letting his memories speak through the strings, because no one else had asked to hear them. That alone was enough to tighten something in Keanu's chest. If anyone deserved a small light in the dark, it was him. But Keanu also understood something deeper. Elias might hesitate. He might feel unworthy. He might believe that recording himself was pointless or that his playing wasn't good enough. The world had spent years telling him so. Keanu would have to be gentle, patient. He couldn't reveal the whole plan at once. If he did, Elias might refuse out of fear or disbelief. This had to be done quietly, without pressure. He would frame it as something simple, capturing a memory, recording a piece for himself, a gift he could keep even as his hands worsened, a moment frozen in time before it slipped away. Keanu's decision wasn't driven by pity. It came from respect, from a deep recognition of someone fighting to hold on to the last thread of what once defined them. Elias wasn't asking for help. He had never asked for anything. That made the gesture even more important. Keanu gathered the equipment carefully, placing the microphone and tripod into a small bag. Tomorrow he would return to Elias's room. He wouldn't reveal the destination. He wouldn't speak of galas or opportunities. He would simply say, "Let me help you keep your music alive." And that would be enough for now. Keanu set the equipment bag beside his chair and let himself breathe for a moment, feeling the shape of the decision settle into something firm and certain. The house around him was quiet, but it was a comforting kind of silence, the kind that helped him think clearly. He stared at the bag, imagining the look on Elias's face when he brought it to the small rented room. Not surprise, not excitement, but perhaps a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. That was what mattered most. A spark. A reminder that he still had something worth sharing. He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the dark street outside. A few cars passed their headlights, sweeping across the pavement like slow-moving ghosts. Keanu watched them for a moment, thinking about the countless people who drifted through life unseen. Elias was one of them, living quietly in a worn-down building with nothing but old photographs to remind him of who he used to be. It wasn't right. Not for a man who had given the world so much beauty, even if few people remembered it now. Keanu pressed his hand lightly against the glass, feeling the coolness under his palm. "You deserve more," he murmured, thinking of Elias's trembling voice as he spoke of lost concerts and fading dreams. He thought again about the platform he planned to send the recording to the anonymous submission. The quiet way Elias's story might reach the right people. There was no promise of success, but there was possibility. And sometimes possibility was enough to change everything. He stepped back from the window, picked up the equipment bag, and placed it by the door. Tomorrow he would begin. Tomorrow the first step toward giving Elias a final stage would be made. Keanu returned to Elias's building the next day, the equipment bag hanging from his shoulder, and a quiet determination guiding his steps. The morning was colder than before, the winter air sharp enough to sting the skin. He climbed the familiar stairs slowly, mindful of the creaking boards beneath his feet. When he reached Elias's door, he paused for just a moment, preparing himself for the conversation ahead. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Self-doubt, once settled into a person's bones, fought hard to stay. He knocked lightly. After a few seconds, the door opened only halfway, and Elias appeared in the gap, his eyes clouded with the same heaviness that had filled them the day before. When he saw Keanu, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something tighter, something like apprehension. "You came back," Elias murmured. "I told you I would," Keanu replied with a gentle smile. He lifted the small equipment bag slightly. "I brought something." Elias's gaze dropped immediately to the bag. His shoulders tensed, and the breath he took was stiff and shallow. What is that?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "Just a camera. A microphone." "Something simple," Keanu explained, stepping inside after Elias moved aside reluctantly. "I thought we could try recording a piece. Something for you. Something to keep." The reaction was immediate. Elias's eyes widened in alarm. He shook his head so quickly his cap shifted. "No," he said, voice cracking. No, I can't do that." His trembling hands rose instinctively as if warding off the idea itself. "Keanu, I can't be filmed. Not like this." Keanu set the bag gently on the table and turned toward him. "It's nothing formal. No pressure." I just think..." But Elias cut him off, pacing toward the cracked window with more agitation than Keanu had ever seen from him. "You don't understand," he said, voice shaking. "I can't perform. Not anymore." He tried flexing his left hand, but the tremor answered, immediately betraying him. His breath hitched. "Look at this. How am I supposed to play when my own body won't obey?" Keanu stepped closer, but kept his voice low and steady. "You played last night, and it was beautiful." "That wasn't beautiful," Elias snapped, though the anger wasn't aimed at Keanu. It was aimed inward. "That was me trying to sound like the man I used to be. But that man is gone. This..." He lifted his trembling hand again, the frustration etched deep into every line of his aging face. "This is what's left." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Elias began pacing again, his movements jittery and filled with panic. "The bow slips, the notes crack, and if you point a camera at me, it will catch every mistake, every failure. I can't bear that, not after all these years." He stopped abruptly, turning toward Keanu, with eyes that glistened under the dim light. I'm a shadow, don't you see? A broken remnant of a better time. Keanu's chest tightened at the words. He stepped forward gently, not to argue, but to anchor the moment before it collapsed entirely. Elias, he said softly, you're not a remnant. You're still here. And your music is still inside you. But Elias shook his head again, retreating into himself, fear etched into every trembling movement. The room felt colder now, filled not with winter air, but with decades of rejection and forgotten hopes. Elias sank slowly onto the edge of his narrow bed, the old mattress creaking under his weight. His hands tightened together in his lap, trembling more now from emotion than age. He wasn't avoiding Keanu's eyes, he simply couldn't meet them. His gaze stayed fixed on the worn floorboards, as if ashamed to exist in his own room. You don't understand what it's like, he whispered, to know exactly how something should sound, how it used to sound, but no longer have the body that can make it happen. Keanu sat on the small chair opposite him, leaning forward just enough to show he was listening, not pushing. Elias's breath grew uneven. Every time I lift the bow, he continued, I feel like I'm betraying the musician I once was, as if I'm proving the world right when they said I was finished. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Do you know what it's like to miss your own hands, to miss the way they used to move before they began to shake on their own? The question wasn't truly meant to be answered. It was a release, a confession of grief that had lived in silence too long. Keanu let the words settle before speaking. You're grieving something real, he said quietly, but that doesn't mean what remains is worthless. Elias shook his head, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. All that remains is a ghost, he said, a memory trying to pretend it's still alive. Keanu opened the equipment bag slowly, not to pressure him, but to show there was nothing intimidating inside. He lifted the small tripod, holding it as gently as someone might hold a fragile instrument. This isn't to judge you, he said, and it's not about perfection. It's about keeping a piece of your music alive, not for an audience, for you. Elias's eyes closed for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. When he opened them again, they were glossy with emotion. You don't know how many times I've tried to play something the way I used to, he said, and every time I fail. Every time my hand betrays me. He lifted his left hand again, showing the tremor as if it were evidence in a trial. Who wants to record a failure? Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice softer than the cold wind seeping through the cracked window. Elias, the world doesn't need perfection. Sometimes the most meaningful performances are the ones that carry the truth of a person's life. Imperfections aren't something to hide, they're part of your story. Elias's lips trembled, not in anger, but in the raw edge of vulnerability. My story is broken, he murmured. Keanu shook his head gently. Your story is human. He set the tripod on the table and unfolded its legs. And it deserves to be heard. For a moment, Elias didn't move. His breathing steadied, but the rest of him remained still, as if frozen at the edge of a decision he'd run from for years. His hands tightened around each other again, the tremors still present, but somehow less defining. You really think there's still music left in me? He asked, voice barely audible. Keanu nodded with quiet certainty. I heard it last night, he said. Even with every tremor, every crack, your heart was still there. Elias inhaled shakily, and something in his posture shifted just a small change, but enough to show a crack in the wall of self-doubt he had built around himself for decades. Elias let his trembling hands fall to his sides, breathing slowly as he searched for the courage he wasn't sure he still possessed. The silence in the room felt heavy, but not suffocating. It felt like a pause before a choice, the kind that could shift the course of a life in ways small but meaningful. He lifted his eyes toward the table where the tripod rested, its simple design almost humble. Yet to him, it looked like a spotlight, a reminder of a world he once belonged to and feared returning to. I don't want anyone to see me fail, he said quietly. Not again. His voice cracked around the edges, breaking open years of quiet shame. When the orchestras let me go, they didn't just take my work. They took the part of me that believed I had something left to offer. Keanu stood and moved nearer, but he didn't touch him or rush him. He simply offered presence, steady and calm. "You're not failing," he said. "You're trying. There's a difference." Elias looked at him, the words settling deeper than he expected. "And what if trying isn't enough?" he whispered. Keanu met his eyes with a gentle certainty. "Then we try again, and again, until you feel ready." Elias's breath trembled, but a faint warmth spread across his expression. Fragile, but real. For the first time, he looked at the violin case beneath the window, not with fear, but with longing. A longing that had survived rejection, injury, and time itself. Maybe, he whispered, maybe I could try one piece, but only if you promise not to judge me. "I won't," Keanu said. "I'll listen." Elias nodded slowly, the smallest spark of trust returning to his voice. "Then let's begin." Elias sat quietly on the edge of his bed as Keanu began unpacking the equipment bag. The camera, the small tripod, the microphone, each item was set down gently, as though the room itself carried a fragile weight. Elias watched in silence, his hands resting on his knees, trembling more now from anticipation than age. Every so often he would glance toward the violin resting beneath the window, then quickly look away, as if afraid he might lose his nerve if he stared too long. Keanu didn't rush. He walked around the small room, studying the angles, the light, the shadows. He stopped near the cracked window, noticing how the winter sun filtered through the fractured pane in soft, uneven beams. It wasn't much, but it created a warm line of light that brushed the floor and the space where Elias usually sat to play. He gently placed the tripod there, adjusting its height so the camera would capture Elias naturally, without making him feel spotlighted or exposed. The cracked window pane reflected just enough of the outside world to give the room a quiet, lived-in warmth, something Keanu knew would feel honest on video. Behind him, Elias let out a long, shaky breath. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu turned toward him, offering reassurance, with a calm expression. "I think it's the right moment," he said softly, "and all you have to do is play. Nothing more." Elias swallowed hard, looking down at his hands as if they were strangers. "I don't know if they'll listen," he murmured, lifting his trembling left hand to show the faint, familiar twitch. Keanu stepped closer, speaking gently. "It's okay. Whatever happens, whatever your hands decide to do, it's part of your story. Just breathe. Let the music come when it wants to." Elias nodded slowly, but uncertainty still clung to him. He reached behind him and lifted the violin case onto his lap. The latches clicked open, with a sound that felt almost ceremonial, like the beginning of something long delayed. He lifted the instrument, carefully cradling it against his chest for a moment before bringing it to rest under his chin. The violin's wood looked worn, but cared for its curves, catching the faint sunlight in a way that made it seem almost timeless. Keanu positioned the microphone a few feet away, angling it upward so it would catch not only the music, but the breath between notes. Everything about his movements was quiet and respectful, giving Elias room to gather himself. He stepped back once the setup was done, folding his hands in front of him as he stood near the door, ready to stay out of the way. Elias took one more breath, then another. His shoulders rose and fell with slow effort. The bow hovered above the strings, twitching slightly with each heartbeat. He closed his eyes tightly for a moment, fighting the fear that told him he wasn't ready, that he would ruin everything the moment he tried. Finally, he exhaled and let the bow touch the string. The first note cracked, shaky and uneven. The second slipped entirely, the bow jerking sideways as his hand spasmed for a split second. "Take your time," Keanu said calmly, though he kept his voice low, letting the silence settle again. Elias tightened his grip on the bow, breathing a little faster now. "I'm trying," he whispered, fighting against the tremor that betrayed him. He lifted the bow again, and this time a soft, trembling note filled the room. That soft note lingered in the air longer than either of them expected, a delicate strand of sound that wavered but did not break. Elias held the bow firmly, though his fingers trembled at the edges, and for a moment he simply breathed through the note, letting it guide him. The room felt different now, as though the tiny space had expanded to make room for the memory of who he once was. Keanu remained completely still, watching quietly without interfering, giving Elias the space to find his footing again. Elias shifted the bow slightly and played the next note. It cracked again, this time from hesitation more than tremor. He winced, shaking his head. "I can't," he muttered under his breath. "It's slipping. Every time it's slipping." His eyes tightened with frustration, the old wound of failure reopening in real time. "You're doing fine," Keanu said gently. Elias didn't respond at first, but he took in the words. He lifted the bow once more. The first few strokes were uneven, the sound jittering between broken tones and fleeting moments of clarity. His left hand twitched during a shift, making the pitch wobble. He sucked in a breath, but he didn't stop. Something in him refused to let go. The room filled with the small battle between his will and his body, each note carrying both defiance and pain. Slowly, something began to shift. The muscle memory buried deep beneath years of silence started to awaken. His wrist loosened. His fingers curved into familiar shapes. His arm, though shaking faintly, began to follow motions it had repeated thousands of times in the past. A phrase emerged, then another, not flawless, not strong, but real. Elias closed his eyes, and the lines of tension in his forehead softened. Keanu noticed it immediately, the subtle transformation, the quiet reclaiming of something lost. Elias was still trembling, still fighting his body, but the music had started to push through the cracks of doubt. Each note gathered strength, forming a melody that drifted through the small room like a story being retold after decades of silence. Elias inhaled deeply, and with that breath, the room changed again. The bow moved faster now, with a rhythm that belonged entirely to him. His fingers slid along the fingerboard with more confidence. His back straightened, and his chin rested against the violin in a way that spoke of long familiarity. The music deepened, gaining color and texture. It wasn't loud, it wasn't pristine, but it was full, painfully full of everything he had lived through. Keanu felt the emotion of the moment wash over him. He had seen artists transform before, but this was different. Elias wasn't performing for applause or for an audience. He was playing for the part of himself that he thought had died. The tremors, the cracks, the uneven breaths, they all became part of the music, shaping it into something raw and beautiful. Elias played on, lost in the melody. His eyes stayed closed, his brow relaxed, and for a brief moment he seemed transported, seeing not the worn-down room around him, but the stages of his past, the crowded halls, the warm lights, the applause he once felt vibrating in his chest. When the bow slipped again, he steadied it without hesitation. He kept playing. He wasn't Elias, the broken musician, anymore. He was Elias, the violinist. The final notes faded into the stillness of the room, drifting gently before dissolving into silence. Elias held the bow suspended in the air for a moment longer, as if afraid that lowering it would break whatever fragile magic had carried him through the performance. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, each one carrying traces of exhaustion and release. Slowly his arm dropped, and he opened his eyes. The moment he did, the weight of uncertainty returned. "I don't know if that was good," he whispered, voice shaking. "I don't know what I sounded like." Keanu stepped forward, but kept his movements gentle. "It was honest," he said. "It was you." Elias shook his head, but his expression softened, touched by something deeper than reassurance. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, clinging to the edges, before falling silently down his cheeks. Instinctively, he lifted his trembling hand to wipe them away, but the motion only made the tears come faster. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel this," Elias murmured, "to play with my whole heart. I thought it was gone." He looked at the violin resting against his knee, his fingers brushing the wood with a tenderness shaped by decades. "It hurt," he admitted softly, "but it also felt like coming home." Keanu nodded. "You gave everything you had. That's all anyone can ask." Elias swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Keanu reached for the camera, still recording the silent aftermath of the performance, and switched it off. He met Elias's eyes with calm certainty. Now, he said, "You let me handle the rest." Elias didn't fully understand what that meant, but he nodded, trusting the quiet conviction in Keanu's voice. Keanu carried the camera bag into his home with a sense of care, usually reserved for fragile memories. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp near the kitchen counter. He set the bag down gently on the table, exhaled, and stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle. The weight of what he had witnessed in Elias's cramped room still lingered in his chest, the trembling notes, the sudden clarity, the tears that fell without shame. It wasn't simply music he had recorded, it was a life resurfacing for a brief, unguarded moment. He powered on his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in pale blue light. When he connected the camera, the file appeared on the screen, immediately labeled with the default timestamp. Keanu clicked it open and leaned closer, watching the small thumbnail expand into motion. The room, the cracked window, the soft daylight bending across Elias's shoulder, all of it appeared exactly as he remembered. But what held him most was the sound. The first trembling notes that cracked across the speaker made Keanu pause. They were imperfect, shaky, and raw. But they were honest. They carried the truth of Elias's struggle and the stubborn resilience still alive beneath the tremors. Keanu listened to the entire performance again, his expression softening when the melody shifted into something deeper and more familiar. Elias's eyes had closed, his posture had straightened, and for those few minutes he had not been a man defined by age or injury. He had been a musician reclaiming a piece of himself. As the final note faded, Keanu felt a quiet certainty settle over him. People needed to hear this, not because it was polished or flawless, but because it was real. Because it carried every scar Elias had worked so hard to hide. Because it showed the world not what perfection looked like, but what courage sounded like. He opened the editing software and began assembling the footage. He trimmed only the excess silence at the beginning and end, leaving every tremor, every slip, every shaky breath exactly as it had happened. Removing them would have felt like erasing the truth. He softened the background noise, slightly adjusted the brightness so the light falling across the violin was warm instead of cold, and balanced the audio levels so each note carried clearly without overwhelming the listener. But he didn't touch the heart of the recording. The imperfections were part of the story. They were what made it human. When the video was ready, he sat back and watched it one final time. He didn't see an old man struggling to reclaim his past. He saw strength shaped by loss. He saw a musician who had survived the erosion of time and disappointment. He saw a soul that still needed to be heard. Keanu exported the finished file and named it simply The Silent Violinist. Then he navigated to the submission page of America's Most Inspiring Musicians, his fingers moving slowly over the keyboard as if mindful of the weight of what he was doing. A form appeared asking for a name, an email, a brief description. He filled in only what was necessary. Where it said, "Submitted by," he left it blank. Where it said, "Artist's story," he typed a single line, "This man deserves one last bow." Keanu hovered over the submit button for a long moment, feeling the quiet gravity of the act. He wasn't sending a polished performance or a showcase of technical mastery. He was sending a fragment of a man's soul captured in trembling tones and uneven breaths. When he finally clicked submit, the page refreshed with a simple confirmation message, understated and almost anonymous. It felt fitting. Elias didn't need fanfare. He needed a chance. He closed the laptop and sat back in his chair, running a hand slowly through his hair. The house felt unusually still, as if waiting. Keanu didn't expect anything to happen immediately. These things took time. Maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe nothing would come of it at all. But the act itself mattered. For years, Elias had played for no one. Tonight, Keanu had carried his music into the world, placing it in hands that valued authenticity over fame. He stood and walked to the kitchen sink, filling a glass of water, while his thoughts drifted back to Elias's tearful expression after the final note. There had been fear in those eyes. Yes, but also a flicker of hope, small, careful, but undeniably present. That flicker was what had stayed with him. It made this quiet effort feel worthwhile. After finishing his water, Keanu returned to the laptop. Something nudged him to check the platform again. He clicked the recent submissions page, not expecting to see anything. But there it was, just a small thumbnail at the bottom of the screen under the queue of new entries, The Silent Violinist. The title blended in among dozens of other uploads, singers, guitarists, dancers, forgotten artists from every corner of the country. Yet, even among those, the image of Elias sitting near the cracked window seemed to carry a distinct stillness, a vulnerability that pulled the eye. Keanu clicked it once, letting it play again, but he muted the audio this time. He didn't need to hear it. He had already heard it in a way few ever would. Instead, he watched Elias's face in the video, the way his brows tightened with effort, the way his eyes closed with concentration, the way his shoulders loosened as muscle memory slowly overtook fear. Every frame told the story of a man reclaiming something he had believed was lost forever. He closed the window gently. There was nothing more to do tonight. But as he walked across the room to turn off the lights, he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted subtly, quietly, like the first movement of a symphony. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a beginning. Outside his house, the city moved on as usual. Cars passed, people walked. Life continued with its usual indifference. But somewhere in a modest rented room on the other side of town, a man slept, not knowing that his music had already begun to drift into unfamiliar hands. Keanu paused at his window, looking out at the soft glow of the street lamps. He hoped Elias would rest well tonight. He hoped he would wake with a little less fear clouding his heart. And he hoped the world, some corner of it, at least would hear what he had heard. A song that trembled, a song that survived, a song that deserved its final bow. Tomorrow, the waiting would begin. The next morning arrived quietly. Keanu woke earlier than usual, the cool air drifting across the room as he sat at the edge of his bed, his thoughts returning immediately to Elias. He brewed a cup of coffee and stood by the counter while it steamed, wondering whether the video had been seen by even a handful of people overnight. He didn't check immediately. He wanted the world to discover the recording naturally, without his interference, without his presence pressing on the outcome. This wasn't about him, and it never would be. After breakfast, he opened his laptop with a calm, steady breath. The submission platform loaded slowly, the screen flickering once before displaying the homepage. He scrolled to the New Voices section, the area featuring recent submissions that had begun to gain quiet traction. He scanned the list without expectation. Then he saw it. The Silent Violinist now rested a few places higher than the night before. Not viral, not exploding with attention, just gently rising like a small tide shifting against the shore. He clicked it again, this time, letting the sound play softly. The trembling notes filled his home, carrying both sorrow and resilience. The imperfections were still there, but they felt less like flaws and more like fingerprints marking the piece as unmistakably Elias. People had left a few comments, simple words, kind words, listeners describing how the music made them pause, how it made them feel something they couldn't quite name. Keanu closed the laptop without hesitation, satisfied. The world had begun listening whether Elias knew it or not. And as Keanu stepped outside into the cool morning, he carried with him the quiet certainty that he had done the right thing. A quiet act, but one that would ripple far beyond this day. The first week passed with quiet uncertainty. Keanu visited Elias's room every few days, carrying bags of warm tea, small pastries, or nothing at all, because sometimes presence meant more than anything he could bring. Elias always greeted him with a tired smile, grateful for the company, but shrinking deeper into discouragement as the days slipped by without news. Each time Keanu walked through the door, he could tell the old man had been hoping for something, anything to change. But the silence stretched on heavy and unbroken. They spent most of their visit sitting at the small table near the cracked window. Elias would hold the violin on his lap, but rarely played more than a few notes. His confidence fragile, even during the recording, seemed to weaken with every passing day. "I shouldn't have let you film me," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was I thinking? Who would care to watch an old man tremble his way through a song?" Keanu shook his head, refusing to let the self-criticism carry weight. "You played with heart," he said softly. "That means more than you think." Still, Elias grew quieter as the week ended. He spent long stretches staring at the old photographs on his table, tracing the younger versions of himself, the man standing tall in orchestra halls, confident, proud, sure of his place. It was clear these images had become both comfort and cruelty. They reminded him of who he had been, but also of who he believed he could never be again. The second week settled in with even more heaviness. The weather turned colder fog, drifting through the streets and pressing against the building like a damp blanket. Keanu stopped by again with hot tea, hoping to lift Elias's spirits. But when he arrived, he found Elias sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor with a distant expression. The violin case lay open beside him, untouched. "It's been 14 days, Elias murmured without looking up. 14 days and nothing has happened." Keanu sat beside him. "These things take time," he said, offering the tea. Elias accepted it with shaking hands, but the warmth seemed unable to reach him. "No one watched it," Elias whispered. "Not really. I shouldn't have hoped." His voice cracked on the last word, as though hope itself had become too heavy to hold. Keanu wanted to tell him the truth, that the video was slowly rising, that small comments had trickled in, that people had been touched, but he didn't want to build false expectations. Not until something concrete arrived. So he spoke gently instead. "You're not foolish for hoping," he said. "Hope is what keeps us alive, even when it hurts." Elias looked at him, then eyes tired but searching. "Maybe for you," he whispered. "For me, hope only reminds me of what I've lost." It was the deepest sadness Keanu had heard from him yet. As the second week closed, Keanu noticed Elias's playing had dwindled even further. The violin stayed mostly on the table, untouched except for the occasional fragment of a melody. Small, hesitant phrases. Nothing like the piece he had played during the recording, as though the music itself was slipping away again. By the third week, Elias's hope had thinned to almost nothing. When Keanu arrived one chilly evening, he found the room dimmer than usual, the curtains drawn halfway, blocking even the weak winter light outside. Elias sat in his usual spot at the table, but his posture had changed. His shoulders slumped, his head lowered, and his violin rested untouched beside him. It looked less like an instrument and more like an artifact of a life that no longer belonged to him. Keanu placed a small bag of tea on the counter and joined him at the table. "Long day?" he asked gently. Elias let out a slow breath. "Long life," he murmured, then tried to cover the heaviness with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He tapped the photograph in front of him, one showing his younger self standing proudly with a violin tucked under his chin. "I sometimes wonder what he would think of me." "Now," Elias said. "Would he be disappointed? Would he even recognize me?" Keanu drew his chair closer. He would see the same man, he said softly. Older, yes. Worn by time, yes. But still the same heart. Elias shook his head, brushing his fingers lightly over the image. He believed in possibility, he said. He woke up every day certain that his dreams were waiting just beyond the next door. He didn't know how fragile everything was. Keanu listened, letting the silence sit before he responded. "That part of you isn't gone," he said. "It's quieter now, maybe, but it's still there." Elias closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the words, as if trying to decide whether to believe them. When he opened them again, they glistened. "I want to believe that," he whispered. "I really do. But every day I wait, and every day nothing happens. And I feel foolish for thinking anyone out there would care." Keanu reached across the table and rested his hand near Elias's, not touching, just offering presence. "Someone will," he said. "Sometimes the world moves slowly, but it does move." Elias looked down at the violin beside him. "I played for myself for so many years," he said, voice fragile. "Now I don't even know why I pick it up anymore." He hesitated. Do you ever feel like your best moments are behind you? Keanu paused, recognizing the pain in the question. I think our best moments change, he said. Sometimes they're behind us, sometimes they're ahead, but they don't disappear. Elias let those words settle deep inside him, his breathing slowing as though something heavy had loosened just slightly. For the first time in days, his hand reached instinctively for the violin case. He didn't open it, but he touched it gently, as if reminding himself that it was still there waiting. Keanu saw the tiny spark return, faint but real, and he knew the waiting was almost over. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into the walls of Elias's tiny room like a familiar companion. The winter light filtering through the cracked window cast pale stripes across the floor. Elias stood near the table, violin in hand, practicing a slow, halting scale. His bow moved tentatively, each note emerging with effort, sometimes steady, sometimes trembling. He paused, often adjusting his grip or shaking out his left hand to ease the stiffness that never truly went away. It wasn't music meant for an audience. It wasn't even music meant for himself. It was simply the act of staying connected to something that had shaped his entire life. Even if hope had worn thin, the violin still called to him on days when loneliness pressed too hard. A sudden knock at the door made him stop mid-note. Only one person ever knocked gently like that. Elias lowered the violin and opened the door to find Keanu standing there with a faint, almost unreadable expression on his face. He wasn't carrying pastries or tea or a warm scarf, only a single white envelope held carefully between his fingers. Elias blinked. "What's that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Keanu stepped inside and closed the door softly behind him. He held the envelope out, not dramatically but with a calmness that made the moment feel strangely profound. "This came for you," he said. Elias stared at the envelope as though it were a relic from another world. His name was written on the front in clean typed letters. His hands began to shake before he even reached for it. "For me," he whispered, almost afraid to ask. Keanu nodded. "For you." Elias took the envelope with trembling fingers. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he traced the printed letters of his own name, as if needing to confirm that it was real, that someone out there had typed those letters intentionally, that he hadn't imagined the growing echo of possibility. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Open it," Keanu said gently. Elias pulled at the sealed edge with unsteady hands. It took him longer than it should have, the paper resisting slightly, his fingers slipping once before he finally managed to tear it open. Inside was a single folded page. He unfolded it slowly. His breath caught as he read the header, "America's Most Inspiring Musicians." He went still, completely still. His eyes scanned the next lines, moving slowly, almost disbelievingly, as though his mind struggled to interpret the words forming in front of him. "Dear Mr. Roth," the letter began. "We are delighted to invite you to perform at our national gala as one of this year's featured artists." The rest of the line blurred as Elias froze in place, his breath leaving him in a quiet, stunned exhale. The paper shook in his grasp. His knees weakened, suddenly forcing him to sit down before they gave out entirely. He read the line again and again. Invited, perform, featured artist, words he had never expected to see associated with his name again. His voice was barely a whisper. This can't be real." Elias held the letter so tightly it crinkled at the edges. His breathing grew faster, as if his body couldn't keep up with the enormity of the moment. He stared at the page again, forcing his eyes to focus on each line. "You are invited. Honored to include you. Your performance moved our selection committee." Every sentence struck him like a wave, each one carrying a different weight of disbelief. He lowered the paper slowly, his hands trembling harder than before. "Keanu, I don't understand." His voice cracked on the words, raw and unguarded. "Why would they choose me? Why would anyone want me on their stage?" There was no bitterness in his tone, only stunned, fragile confusion. For so long he had believed the world had closed its doors to him. To be welcomed now felt too overwhelming to process. Keanu pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. "Because they heard something real," he replied. "Because your music still has a voice. and because someone needed to remind them that talent doesn't disappear just because time passes. Elias shook his head slowly, gripping the edge of the letter as if it might vanish. "Someone recommended me," he whispered. "The letter says that. Someone submitted me. Someone believed I belonged there." His eyes lifted toward Keanu's, full of searching vulnerability. "Who did it?" Keanu held his gaze calm and steady. "Someone who believes in you," he said softly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Those words hit Elias harder than the invitation itself. His lips parted, but no sound came out. A tear slipped down his cheek, falling onto the paper in his hands. Then another. Soon his shoulders shook, not with despair, but with a kind of release he had been denying himself for years. He pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to steady the sob rising in his throat. "I thought it was over for me," he whispered. "I thought my life had already played its last note." Keanu placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, offering strength without intrusion. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, the tears falling freely now. "I never thought I would get one more chance. Not at my age. Not like this." He took a shaky breath. "I don't deserve this." "You do," Keanu said firmly. "You've carried your music through more pain than most people ever will. That deserves to be heard." Elias looked down at the invitation again, reading the lines for the 10th time. The gala date, the location, the rehearsal schedule. It all felt impossibly real, and impossibly terrifying. "What if I can't do it?" he asked quietly. "What if I get on that stage and my hand fails me? What if they regret choosing me?" Keanu's voice softened. "They chose you because of who you are, not because of perfection." Elias pressed the letter to his chest, closing his eyes as he breathed through the swirl of fear, hope, disbelief, and gratitude colliding inside him. "Someone believed in me," he whispered again, almost in awe. Keanu nodded. "And now the world will too." 2 days before the gala, the weather had turned sharp and cold, the kind of cold that crept through windows and settled in old bones. Inside his small room, Elias stood near the table, violin in hand, trying to rehearse the opening lines of the piece he planned to play. His movements were slow and careful, each stroke of the bow measured, as though he feared even the slightest mistake might shatter everything he had gained. Keanu sat nearby on the same worn chair he always used, quietly encouraging him without interrupting. Elias lifted the bow. The first note came out thin. The second wavered. He frowned, shaking his left hand to ease the trembling that had grown worse over the past week. "It's just nerves," he muttered softly. "It will pass." Keanu nodded gently, giving him space, but staying close enough that Elias could feel supported. He tried again. The bow pressed against the string, but instead of sound, a sharp spasm shot through his arm. Elias gasped and stumbled forward. The violin slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a hollow, unforgiving sound. Keanu bolted upright. "Elias," he called out, reaching him just as the old man crumpled to his knees. Elias clutched his arm, his breath quickening as pain radiated through the weakened muscles. "I can't. My arm," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Keanu slid an arm around him, lifting him carefully. "We're going to the hospital," he said. Elias didn't protest. He didn't have the strength. The drive to the emergency room felt unbearably long. Elias leaned back in the passenger seat, eyes shut tight, breathing in small, shaky bursts. Keanu kept glancing over, trying to hide the fear tightening in his chest. He had seen people break down before, but this felt different. This felt like watching a dream unravel in front of him, thread by fragile thread. At the hospital, nurses moved quickly. They helped Elias into a wheelchair, checked his vital signs, and guided him into a small examination room. Keanu stayed just outside the curtain until Elias insisted he enter. The doctor arrived after several minutes, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a calm demeanor. She examined Elias's arm, gently asking questions about his symptoms, his past injury, and the recent increase in tremors. When she finished, she pulled up a chair and sat beside him. Her expression softened in that way professionals often did when preparing someone for difficult news. "Mr. Roth," she said quietly, The nerve deterioration in your arm has progressed. More than before. Elias swallowed hard, his eyes clouding. The doctor continued. This type of decline can happen with age and previous trauma. It doesn't mean you can't use your arm, but fine motor control, like playing the violin, will continue to get harder. Elias's breath hitched. So it's getting worse, he said. Even if I rest? The doctor nodded. I'm afraid so. Keanu watched the hope drain from Elias's face like a fading light. The old man looked down at his trembling hand, flexing his fingers as though testing a betrayal he couldn't accept. The gala, he whispered. The doctor gave him a sympathetic look. It won't harm you to play one more time, she said gently, but you may not be able to perform the way you expect. Those words cut deeper than any diagnosis. Elias lowered his head, fighting tears. His dream, his last dream, was slipping away. Keanu walked beside Elias as the nurses wheeled him out of the examination room. The hallway felt too bright, too sterile, as though the world had suddenly become unforgivingly clear. Elias sat silently, his gaze fixed on the trembling hand resting in his lap. Every flicker of his fingers reminded him of what the doctor had said, of everything he feared losing. When they reached the waiting area, he asked the nurse for a moment alone. She nodded and left quietly. Keanu pulled up a chair and sat facing him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound came from the soft hum of the overhead lights. Finally, Elias exhaled slowly. It's over, he whispered. I can't do it, Keanu. I can't walk onto that stage and pretend I'm still who I used to be. He shook his head weakly. I'll drop the bow. I'll miss the notes. I'll embarrass myself. I should cancel before they regret inviting me. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on his knees. You don't have to pretend, he said quietly. You never did. Elias looked up, his eyes filled with despair. How can I perform like this? He asked. Look at my hand. He lifted it shakily. What kind of musician can't trust his own fingers? Keanu watched him carefully, then spoke with calm conviction. A musician whose story is bigger than technique. Elias frowned, confused. Keanu continued. Your performance isn't about flawless notes. It's about the life behind them. Every slip, every tremor, every breath you take on that stage, it all tells the truth of who you are. And that truth is powerful. Elias closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him, but fear still clung to his voice. People don't want truth, he murmured. They want brilliance. Keanu shook his head. Not this time. They invited you because your music moved them, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Elias hesitated, gripping the arm of the chair. But what if I break down up there? What if I fail in front of everyone? Keanu placed a steady hand near his, offering reassurance without pressure. Then you fail bravely, he said. Then you show them what it means to try when your body is working against you. That courage is your music now. Elias swallowed, hard emotion tightening his throat. Courage, he whispered. I used to have that. Keanu shook his head gently. You still do. It brought you this far. Elias lowered his gaze again. I don't know if I can walk onto that stage, Keanu answered softly. Then I'll walk with you. Elias's breathing wavered, but a faint, fragile warmth touched his expression. You really believe I should still perform? He asked. Keanu nodded. I do, because your story is the music. The words settled deeply in Elias's heart, steadying something inside him that had been shaking for years. He looked at his trembling hand again, but this time with a different kind of understanding. Not despair, but acceptance. And slowly, he nodded. The morning after the hospital visit, Elias moved slowly around his small room. His body still stiff, but his spirit caught somewhere between fear and determination. The invitation letter lay on the table where he had placed it the night before. He had reread it at least a dozen times, each reading bringing equal measures of disbelief and dread. The gala was only a day away, and every moment that passed felt like a reminder of the uncertainty ahead. Keanu arrived carrying a garment bag slung over his shoulder and a small wooden box under his arm. When Elias opened the door, Keanu offered a gentle smile. "Thought we could start getting ready," he said. Elias glanced at the bag and grimaced nervously. "Ready." He repeated the word, weighed with anxiety. "It's been years since I prepared for anything like a performance." Keanu stepped inside, placing the garment bag carefully on the bed. "Then we'll take it slowly," he said. Elias looked at him with an expression caught between gratitude and exhaustion. "I'm afraid," he confessed quietly. "Not just of playing, of being seen." Keanu nodded, acknowledging the truth without diminishing it. Being seen takes courage, more courage than most people realize. He unzipped the garment bag. Inside was Elias's old performance suit, the one he had kept folded for decades. The fabric was worn but intact, a deep charcoal color with faint signs of age. Elias reached out and touched it lightly, his fingers brushing the material as if greeting an old friend he had long avoided. "I haven't worn this in 27 years, he murmured. "I thought I never would again." Keanu placed the wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside lay a polishing cloth, a small brush, and a few tools used for instrument care. He lifted the violin from its usual resting spot and set it gently inside the box's cushioned frame. "Let's give your violin some attention," he said. Elias watched him, his eyes softening as the familiar rituals resurfaced. Keanu polished the wood with slow, steady motions, restoring a faint shine to the instrument that had carried so much of Elias's life. The old man sat down, rubbing his thumb over his trembling fingers. "I can barely keep my hand steady," he whispered. "How can I stand in front of a crowd and pretend I belong there?" Keanu paused and looked at him carefully. "You're not pretending," he said. "You're sharing something real. People respond to honesty." Elias shook his head gently. "Honesty won't stop my fingers from shaking." "No," Keanu agreed, "but it will help the world understand you. And that's what this performance is about." He handed the polished violin back to Elias, who held it with a mixture of reverence and fear. "Shall we practice a few small sections?" Keanu asked. Elias hesitated, but eventually nodded. He lifted the violin beneath his chin. The first notes he attempted were shaky and thin, the bow slipping more than he wanted. Frustration crossed his face, but Keanu encouraged him gently. "Don't focus on the tremors," he said. "Focus on the feeling." Elias inhaled deeply and tried again. This time, the melody emerged uneven but sincere, shaped not by perfect technique, but by the weight of years lived and survived. Keanu closed his eyes, listening, letting the emotion of the music speak louder than any flaw. Elias lowered the bow after a few measures, breathing heavily. "It's not like it used to be," he said. "It doesn't need to be," Keanu replied. "It just needs to be yours." Elias lowered the violin, his breath slowing as he tried to steady the tremor still rippling through his fingers. He stared at his hand as though willing it to behave, willing it to remember the certainty it once carried. "I don't want to disappoint them," he whispered. "Not after everything." Keanu shook his head gently. "You won't. You're not going on that stage to impress anyone. You're going to speak in the only language that has never abandoned you." Elias looked at the polished instrument resting against his knee. A faint reflection of the cracked window shimmered across its surface, blending present and past in a way that made his throat tighten. "I used to shine this violin before every performance," he said. "I told myself it deserved to look its best, even when I didn't feel like I deserved to stand in front of people." He paused, voice softening. "Somehow I thought the violin carried more dignity than I did." Keanu sat beside him. "It still carries dignity," he said, "because you gave it that through every year you played, even when no one was listening." Elias blinked, absorbing the words quietly. Slowly, he lifted the violin again, letting his fingers settle into familiar places along the neck. He didn't try to play a full piece this time, only a short sequence, a few tender notes that wavered like a candle flame in the wind. Keanu listened closely, not to judge, but to feel the intention behind each tremor. When Elias finished, he lowered the bow with a long exhale. "I suppose that will have to be enough," he said. Keanu nodded. "It will, because it's honest." Elias managed a faint, fragile smile. "Honest," he repeated, as if testing the word. They spent the next hour rehearsing small phrases, not pushing too hard, not aiming for perfection. Sometimes Elias stopped mid-note to massage his hand. Sometimes he grew frustrated, muttering under his breath. But every time Keanu encouraged him to continue, reminding him that tomorrow's performance was not about flawless execution. It was about courage. It was about memory. It was about reclaiming something he believed he had lost. As the session drew to a close, Elias set the violin gently inside its case. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but a quiet resolve had replaced some of the earlier fear. He looked at Keanu, uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. "I haven't stepped onto a real stage in 27 years, he said softly. "I don't know if I can do it." Keanu placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You won't be alone," he said. "I'll be right there." Elias breathed in slowly, letting the reassurance settle. For the first time, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel impossible. It felt like a final bow, waiting to be taken. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, crisp wind sweeping through the city, carrying with it the kind of anticipation that made the air feel alive. The grand performance hall glowed warmly against the winter evening, its tall windows spilling light onto the sidewalk where guests in elegant coats streamed inside. Inside the lobby, chandeliers washed the marble floor in soft gold, and the hum of voices echoed through the vast space. Musicians tuning their instruments, reporters adjusting their cameras, supporters greeting one another with excitement. It was a night meant for brilliance, a night meant for stories worth remembering. Backstage, however, the atmosphere felt very different. Elias stood near a rack of stage equipment, gripping the edge of a table to steady himself. His suit, freshly pressed and carefully chosen, looked dignified on him, but his face had gone pale, almost ghost-like. His hand shook violently, far worse than at home. Every breath he took seemed shallow, as though fear had stolen the air from his lungs. Keanu stayed close, blending into the shadows, just as he promised. He wasn't there as a celebrity or as someone seeking attention, only as support, quiet and steadfast. He watched Elias's trembling hand and stepped closer. "You're doing better than you think," he murmured. Elias shook his head, eyes wide with dread. "I don't belong here," he whispered. "These people, they're real musicians. They'll see me walk out there and wonder why an old man was allowed on their stage." Keanu placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You belong here because you lived your music," he said. "You earned this place through every hardship you survived." Elias tried to swallow, but the fear held tight to his throat. "What if I fail?" he whispered. "What if the bow slips again? What if they laugh?" Keanu leaned slightly closer. "Standing here is already the victory," he said. "Everything after this is a gift." The stage manager hurried in, glancing down at her clipboard before looking up at Elias. "Mr. Roth." "You're next," she said with a warm, encouraging smile. Elias stiffened. The words hit him like a jolt, sending another wave of tremors through his hand. His eyes darted toward the curtain that separated him from the massive crowd. Beyond it, hundreds of people sat waiting in anticipation. The realization nearly stole his breath again. Keanu stepped in front of him and held his gaze. "Listen to me," he said softly. "You're not going out there alone. I'll be right behind the curtain the whole time. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to take one step." Elias closed his eyes for a moment. His grip tightened around the violin, and for a second, he looked as though he might collapse again. But then he exhaled slowly, grounding himself. "One step," he repeated under his breath. The stage lights dimmed, and the announcer's voice echoed across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's featured performance comes from a musician whose story has touched our hearts. Please welcome Elias Roth." The words seemed to vibrate through Elias's chest. The curtain opened slightly. A flood of bright light spilled into the backstage area, illuminating him fully. Elias took a shaky breath, lifted his chin, and stepped onto the stage. The brightness hit him instantly. The lights blinded him, washing the audience into a blur of indistinct shapes. His heart hammered so loudly he could feel it in his fingertips. The crowd went silent. He stood alone at the center, trembling visibly. He cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. His voice cracked with raw emotion as he spoke. A kind stranger believed in me when no one else in my life would. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience as they leaned forward intrigued. For a moment, no one breathed. Elias stood beneath the lights, small and fragile against the vastness of the hall, yet somehow every eye was fixed on him. His confession hung in the air like a single vibrating note, honest and trembling. He tightened his grip on the violin, his fingers shaking so visibly that a few murmurs whispered through the crowd. But there was no mockery in the room, only curiosity, only empathy waiting to be awakened. He adjusted the violin beneath his chin. It felt heavier tonight, as if carrying the full weight of his years. His bow hovered over the strings, trembling in rhythm with his heartbeat. Elias swallowed, wetting his dry throat, and tried to steady his breathing. For a split second, doubt surged through him, sharp, suffocating, overwhelming. But then he remembered Keanu's words. One step, one note, one truth. He lowered the bow. The first sound was thin and unsteady, wavering as his arm fought to hold the stroke. A few people leaned even closer, sensing the fragility of the moment. Elias closed his eyes, letting the room fade. He focused on the memory of his younger self, the man standing in old photographs, proud and hopeful. Not perfect, not flawless, just alive with purpose. The next note emerged with slightly more strength, though still trembling. Another followed, uneven but sincere. Elias pressed through the instability, guiding the melody forward with whatever control his body could muster. His left hand shook during the shifts, but he corrected instinctively, refusing to surrender to the tremor. With each measure, the emotion inside him grew stronger, rising from a place deeper than muscle memory. Halfway through the piece, a soft gasp rippled through the audience. They could hear it now, the story in his music. The years of fighting, losing, hoping, collapsing, rising. The melody wove through the hall like a confession spoken without words. Backstage, Keanu watched from behind the curtain, his heart tightening as Elias poured everything he had into the performance. He saw the tremors, the mistakes, the moments where Elias nearly faltered, but he also saw the courage, the transformation, the quiet victory unfolding note by note. Elias reached the final phrase. His arm trembled so fiercely he nearly dropped the bow, but he gathered every last bit of strength. The final note quivered, stretched thin, then faded gently into the silence. For a moment, the hall remained perfectly still. Then the applause began. Not polite, not reserved, a rising wave of sound, warm and deeply moved. Elias opened his eyes, breath, shaking, tears forming. He had done it. The applause slowly faded as Elias steadied his breathing, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood center stage, lit by a warm circle of light, the violin trembling in his hands. The hall stretched before him in a shimmering blur of faces and anticipation. He knew the real performance, the one he had feared, dreamed of, and doubted for years, was about to begin. The bow in his right hand shook so hard he had to tighten his grip, and his left fingers tingled with the familiar weakness that had threatened to take everything from him. He lifted the violin beneath his chin again. The hall shifted, growing still, as hundreds leaned forward, silent and waiting. Elias drew a breath and lowered the bow onto the string. The first note wavered immediately, thin, unstable, almost breaking. A few people exchanged glances, not unkindly, but startled at the vulnerability of the sound. His bow slipped on the next stroke, skidding across the string with a rough whisper. Heat flooded Elias's face. His hand trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment he thought he might stop right there, turn and walk off the stage before humiliation could sink deeper. But then he closed his eyes. He let the noise of the room fade. Let the fear sink beneath the surface of a deeper memory, the memory of why he played in the first place. Suddenly he was not an old man on a brightly lit stage. He was a boy again, standing in a cramped apartment in Eastern Europe, playing for his mother as she stirred soup on the stove. He was a young musician performing in small concert halls, heart pounding with hope. He was a man surviving loss, finding refuge in music when the world felt unkind. He surrendered to the melody. The next notes emerged differently, still flawed, still trembling, but filled now with something ancient and aching. The hall grew silent. Even the air felt suspended, as though the room itself held its breath. Each phrase carried pieces of his life, the joy, the longing, the heartbreak, the resilience. The imperfections became part of the storytelling truths his words never could. He opened his eyes briefly enough to see the blurred outline of the audience leaning closer, not in judgment, in understanding. The bow moved unevenly across the strings, but the emotion anchored him. People who had never heard his name before tonight now followed every movement, every breath. The melody deepened, filling the hall with a quiet, trembling courage that resonated far beyond technical skill. Then, halfway through the piece, pain shot through his hand, a sharp, sudden jolt. His fingers faltered, nearly losing the shift entirely. The bow wavered dangerously. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. For a heartbeat, Elias froze, panic spiking through him. The tremor spread violently across his hand, threatening to pull the bow from his grip. His chest tightened, breath catching. He was seconds away from collapse. But something inside him refused. He pressed on. He pushed through the tremor, forcing his fingers to obey, even when they trembled uncontrollably. Tears gathered in his eyes, not from fear, but from the fierce, overwhelming need to finish what he had started. The bow steadied enough for the next phrase to emerge, raw and trembling, but alive. Slowly, painfully, the melody rose again, carrying the weight of a lifetime that refused to bow to failure. Elias drew in a breath that shuddered through his entire body. He could feel the tremor racing from his shoulder to his fingertips, but he held the bow firmly, refusing to let it slip again. The hall remained completely silent, every spectator suspended in the fragile moment with him. He lifted the violin just a little higher, steadying it against his chin, and let the next sequence begin. The notes emerged shaky at first, trembling like a voice on the edge of tears. But with each measure, emotion filled the gaps that technique could no longer cover. He let the music pour out of him. The sadness, the years of rejection, the quiet nights spent playing alone near that cracked window, the lost opportunities, the lingering hope, everything he carried, every scar, every memory flowed into the melody. He felt it rise through him, overwhelming and cleansing, as though the violin had become the last thread tying him to the man he once was. And still he played. The bow scraped once, twice, but each recovery deepened the meaning of the piece, shaping it into something human and profoundly real. Several people in the audience wiped their eyes. Some leaned forward with their hands clasped, as if rooting for him with every breath. They could hear the truth in the music. They could feel the years behind it. And they knew this was no ordinary performance. It was a life speaking through the strings. Keanu watched from behind the curtain, his chest tight with admiration and sorrow. He had known Elias's story mattered, but seeing it unfold in real time in front of hundreds of people felt almost sacred. As the piece neared its final passage, Elias's arm began to weaken again. The tremor spread more violently, jerking the bow enough to nearly break the phrase. He winced, fighting against the sharp pain radiating up his arm, but he didn't stop. He guided the bow through the final climb of the melody, each note heavier than the last. His breath trembled, his eyes blurred, his fingers struggled to hold the final chord. And then, with every ounce of strength he had left, he drew the bow across the strings one last time. The final note rang out thin but piercing, carrying a lifetime of longing in its fragile echo. He let the bow fall to his side. Silence. A full second passed, then another, and then the hall erupted. The applause rose like a wave, powerful and overwhelming. People stood first in scattered bursts, then in unison. A standing ovation, loud and heartfelt, washing over the stage like a warm tide. Elias blinked against the lights, stunned. His chest heaved as the applause grew louder, filling the entire hall. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. Seen not as the man he used to be, but as the man he still was. The applause thundered across the hall. echoing through every corner like a wave that refused to fade. Elias stood under the bright lights, blinking against their intensity, his breath trembling as the audience rose to their feet. He bowed deeply, his back bending with both humility and astonishment. The roar grew louder. Some people whistled, some clapped with hands over their hearts, some simply stood motionless, overwhelmed by the emotion of what they had witnessed. But amid the overwhelming brightness of the stage, something in the shadows caught Elias's attention. Movement, subtle, familiar. He lifted his gaze toward the side curtain. There, half hidden behind a tall piece of stage equipment, stood Keanu. He wasn't in the spotlight. He wasn't in a position to be noticed. His hands rested in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but attentive. He made no gesture to step forward, no attempt to draw the crowd's eyes to himself. He simply watched, quietly, steadily, almost invisibly. The contrast struck Elias deeply. The hall was ablaze with applause camera flashes, bursting like tiny fireworks from the audience. The lights washed everything in gold, and yet Keanu remained in a dim corner, choosing the shadows as if that was where he felt he belonged, far from credit, far from recognition, far from any moment that would make this about him. Elias's eyes locked onto him. Keanu didn't move at first. He simply held his gaze, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod, a nod that carried meaning deeper than words, a nod that said everything I told you, that you could do this. I'm proud of you. This night belongs to you. The emotion flooded Elias so quickly his breath hitched in his throat. His eyes stung immediately, tears forming faster than he could blink them back. All around him, the audience continued applauding, unaware of the quiet exchange happening behind the curtain. They saw a triumphant musician, a man rediscovered by the world. But Elias saw something else entirely. He saw the person who had carried him to this moment without ever stepping into the light. The thought broke him open again, not because of the applause, not because of the standing ovation, but because he understood finally fully that he had not reached this stage alone. Someone had fought for him quietly, without demand, without expectation, without ever pushing forward to be acknowledged. Keanu didn't lift a hand to wave. He didn't step closer. He didn't smile broadly or make a show of anything. He just stood there steady and humble, as though he were witnessing something sacred. When the crowd's clapping grew even louder, he looked away for a moment, giving Elias privacy in his triumph. Elias pressed his lips together, struggling to hold back a sob. He bowed again, but this time the gesture was slower, more emotional. When he straightened, he glanced once more toward the shadows. Keanu was still there, still silent, still choosing not to step into the light. The spotlight belonged solely to Elias, and Keanu would do nothing to take even a sliver of it away. It was a moment of deep, wordless understanding, and it pierced Elias's heart more powerfully than any applause ever could. Elias stood a little straighter, tears slipping down his cheeks as the audience continued cheering. But his eyes never left the dim corner. Every clap, every flash, every sign of praise only seemed to illuminate how deeply Keanu had stayed hidden. Elias lifted the violin to his chest, holding it close, as though anchoring himself to the moment. It wasn't the applause that grounded him. It was the quiet presence behind the curtain. He bowed once more, but this time he directed the bow slightly toward the shadows. A small gesture, one only Keanu would understand. When he rose again, he saw Keanu's head dip in a return acknowledgement, subtle and sincere. No one else noticed. No one else needed to. The stage manager approached him from the side, gesturing kindly toward the backstage area so the next performer could begin preparing. Elias nodded, though his legs felt unsteady beneath him. As he stepped backward toward the curtain, the applause still thundered through the hall, rolling over him like a warm ocean tide. His heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion. When he slipped behind the curtain, the noise softened, but didn't disappear entirely. The dim backstage lighting wrapped around him like a calmer world after a storm. And there, waiting, stood Keanu, still in the shadows, still quiet. Elias stopped in front of him, breath breaking again. "You were there," he whispered, voice thick. Keanu nodded gently. Where else would I be? Elias shook his head, wiping at his cheeks with trembling fingers. You didn't come out. You didn't let them see you. Keanu kept his hands in his pockets, offering a small, warm smile. This was your night, he said, not mine. The words hit Elias harder than the applause had. He took a slow step toward him. You fought for me, he said, emotion cracking each syllable. You carried me back to the world when I had already given up. Keanu shook his head slightly. I didn't carry you, he replied. I just opened a door. You walked through it. Elias lowered his gaze, overcome. I wish they knew what you did, he murmured. I wish they knew who made this possible. Keanu gently reached out and touched Elias's shoulder, a rare moment of open comfort. They know what they need to, he said. They saw your heart. That's the story that matters. Elias closed his eyes, absorbing every word. When he opened them again, he saw Keanu standing exactly as he had earlier, humble, steady, and perfectly content, remaining unseen. That humility struck something deep inside Elias, something tender and grateful. He realized then that the tears filling his eyes had little to do with the applause waiting beyond the curtain. They came from knowing someone had believed in him quietly, fiercely, and without asking for a single moment of recognition. The audience might remember the performance, but Elias would remember this. The sun rose quietly over Portland the next morning, but the world felt anything but quiet. Elias woke up earlier than usual, still exhausted from the emotional whirlwind of the previous night. He reached for his violin case out of habit, then stopped remembering everything that had happened, the stage, the applause, the faces in the crowd leaning forward to hear every trembling note. It didn't feel real. For a long moment, he simply sat on the edge of his bed, breathing deeply, as though anchoring himself to the truth. Across town, Keanu woke to the soft chime of his phone vibrating nonstop. Message after message poured in, most from friends and colleagues, sending him video clips, articles, and trending posts. Every headline seemed to echo the same theme: a forgotten violinist reclaims the stage. The performance video from the gala had been uploaded within hours, and viewers were struck by the raw emotion in Elias's music. It didn't sound polished. It didn't need to. The tremors, the slips, the wavering bow, all of it told a story of endurance. On social media, the reaction grew rapidly. People described how the music brought them to tears, how it reminded them of their grandparents, their teachers, their own abandoned dreams. Teachers shared clips in their classrooms. Young musicians commented that they found courage in seeing someone fragile still standing on a stage. Some wrote that the performance felt like someone holding open a door to a more hopeful world. By mid-morning, the phrase, "the violinist who returned for his final bow," began trending nationwide. The original recording Keanu had submitted under the name The Silent Violinist resurfaced as curious viewers traced Elias's story backward. The video Keanu had edited so carefully, quietly, regained momentum, gathering comments from listeners who now understood the deeper context behind the trembling notes. Elias, meanwhile, had no idea. He didn't have much experience with the world of online sharing and digital fame. His life had been shaped by small rooms, small performances, and the quiet routine of being overlooked. When Keanu arrived at his door with 2 cups of warm tea and a gentle knock, Elias greeted him with a tired smile. His hands still trembled, but now the tremor held something different, an echo of joy mixed with disbelief. Keanu sat beside him, sensing the swirl of emotions. "Have you checked anything online this morning?" he asked softly. Elias shook his head immediately, almost embarrassed by the idea. "I wouldn't even know where to look," he said with a small laugh. "Besides, last night was already more than I ever expected. I don't need anything else." Keanu smiled, though his eyes held something Elias didn't yet understand. "You might want to see what people are saying," he replied. "The world heard you, Elias." Elias blinked, unsure whether to believe him. "They heard me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Truly heard me." Keanu nodded. "More than you know." Elias took a long, steadying breath. He didn't open his phone right away. Part of him feared that if he saw too much excitement, it would slip through his fingers like a dream. But he trusted Keanu, a man who had done everything quietly, never asking for recognition. If Keanu said the world was listening, then perhaps, just perhaps, it was true. And somewhere deep in his chest, a forgotten warmth began to flicker again. Later that afternoon, the world tightened its focus on Elias in ways he never imagined possible. Music blogs began writing feature stories about him, calling his performance a reminder of why art matters. Commentators praised the honesty of his playing. Instead of technical perfection, they highlighted the courage of a man who walked back into a spotlight after nearly 3 decades of silence. By evening, several major news outlets had picked up the story, describing him as a symbol of perseverance in a world that often forgets its elders. As the flood of attention grew, invitations began arriving from every direction. Local orchestras reached out, asking if he would consider joining rehearsals or mentoring young musicians. Community centers asked if he might share his life story with students who struggled with confidence. A small university in the Midwest even offered to fly him out for a special guest appearance. For the first time in many years, the phone in Elias's small room rang more than once in a day. Elias listened to each invitation with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had spent so many years fading into the background that suddenly being asked to participate in anything felt overwhelming. His hands shook as he read through messages from strangers thanking him for his courage. One message came from a teenage girl battling a neurological condition. She wrote that seeing him play, despite his tremors, made her feel less ashamed of her own limitations. Elias read her words slowly, feeling tears gather in his eyes. If my music reached even one person like her, he whispered, then everything was worth it. Keanu visited again that evening, stepping into the small apartment with the same quiet presence he always carried. Elias looked up from a pile of printed emails and letters, his expression filled with confusion and gratitude. I don't understand why this is happening, he said. Why would anyone care about an old man like me? Keanu sat down across from him, meeting his eyes with calm sincerity. Because your music told the truth, he said. People can feel that. They always have. They just needed a chance to hear you again. Elias nodded, slowly absorbing the words. For the first time, he didn't try to argue. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle around him. A life that had felt almost finished just weeks earlier was suddenly opening again, as if someone had unlocked a door he thought had rusted shut forever. Journalists soon began asking questions about the mysterious kind stranger mentioned in Elias's introduction at the gala. They wanted a name, a story, a face, but Elias refused every request with gentle firmness. Some blessings are meant to stay anonymous, he told them. The man who helped me didn't do it for attention. He gave me back my music. That is enough. Keanu, hearing these statements through friends and online clips, felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He stayed far from the spotlight, content to watch from a distance. Seeing Elias reclaim his dignity and place in the world was more meaningful than any recognition could offer. As night settled over the city, Elias sat by his window with his violin resting beside him. The tremor in his hand was still there, but for the first time in many years, it didn't represent defeat. It represented survival, hope, a story still unfolding. And in another corner of the city, Keanu closed his eyes, grateful that the world had finally rediscovered a man who never should have been forgotten. Keanu walked through Portland's Old Town with the evening settling softly around him. The air carried the same cold bite it had the night he first heard Elias playing in the shadows. But the city felt different now. The lights seemed warmer, the sidewalks quieter, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. He moved at a slow pace, hands tucked into his coat pockets, letting the familiar rhythm of footsteps guide him toward the alley that had changed everything. When he reached it, he stopped at the mouth of the narrow passageway. The same weak street lamp flickered overhead, casting a thin glow across the cracked pavement. The alley was silent now, but the silence felt fuller, holding memories the way old walls hold echoes. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, remembering that trembling melody, the one fragile note that had stopped him in his tracks and tugged at something deep inside him. He opened his eyes again and looked into the empty space where Elias had once stood, with his violin tucked under his chin, pouring out decades of loneliness into sound. Back then, Keanu didn't know the man's story. He didn't know about the injury, the lost career, the long years of isolation. All he had felt was a pull, a sense that someone needed to be heard, and that instinct, so small at first, had grown into something greater than he ever expected. As he stood there now, he realized how easily moments like that could disappear. A musician in an alley, a broken bow, a fading dream. Life had a way of letting beauty slip between the cracks when no one was paying attention. Elias's story wasn't rare. Every city was filled with people holding on to quiet talents, quiet hopes, quiet griefs. Not forgotten because they lacked worth, but forgotten because no one had paused long enough to notice. Keanu breathed in the cold air, feeling it tighten his chest. He thought about Elias waking up each morning in that small room with the cracked window, believing his best years were behind him. He thought about the hands that shook, the voice that wavered, the memories he carried, like old sheet music folded in his heart. And then he thought about the moment everything shifted. The moment a man who felt invisible stepped onto a stage again and discovered that the world still had space for him. The transformation hadn't come from fame or applause. It hadn't come from being placed in the spotlight. It came from something much quieter. One person listening. One person believing. One person saying without words, "You still matter." Keanu had seen that truth play out more than once in his life. He knew how a single gesture could redirect a path, how a moment of kindness could ripple through someone's entire existence. Watching Elias reclaim his sense of purpose reminded him of how fragile human confidence could be and how powerful encouragement was when offered without expectation. He took one last look at the alley, letting the memory settle. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the resting place of a song that had completed its journey. Keanu stepped away from the alley and continued walking, letting the quiet streets guide him. With each step, he reflected on what the past few weeks had shown him. Elias's journey wasn't just a story about music. It was a reminder of how easily people can fade into the background when life becomes heavy. Sometimes it takes only one moment of listening to pull someone back into the light. He passed small storefronts with their lights dimmed for the night. A bakery, a vintage shop, a tiny cafe with chairs stacked neatly inside. Every window he passed reminded him that behind each door lived people fighting their own unseen battles. Some were holding on to dreams that felt too heavy. Some carried talents no one bothered to ask about. Some were waiting for anyone to recognize that they still had something to give. Elias had believed his time had passed. He thought he was too old, too broken, too forgotten to matter anymore. But the world had proved him wrong, not because of grand miracles, but because one person paid attention. One person saw worth where others saw age. One person followed a trembling sound into the cold and chose compassion over convenience. Keanu thought about how easy it would have been to keep walking that night. He had been tired from filming, eager to go home, lost in his own thoughts. If he had taken just 2 more steps forward, he might never have heard the violin. He might never have met Elias. The performance, the standing ovation, the nationwide response, none of it would have happened. It all came from a single moment of stopping, a single choice to listen. He paused at a crosswalk and looked up at the sky. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain, but the city lights softened their edges. He felt a sense of calm move through him. Not pride, not accomplishment, just gratitude. Gratitude that he had been in the right place at the right time and that he had listened when it mattered. As he continued walking, he replayed Elias's trembling voice on that stage. "A kind stranger believed in me when no one else in my life would." Those words echoed more deeply than any applause. They carried the truth that people often forget: belief is a powerful gift. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't require fame or influence. It simply requires presence. Keanu reached the corner where the street opened into a wider avenue. Cars rolled past slowly, their headlights streaking across the pavement. He stood there for a moment, letting everything settle inside him. Elias was out there somewhere, waking to a new life, a new purpose. Not because of luck, not because of chance, but because hope had been handed back to him. Keanu knew that others would hear Elias's story and find pieces of themselves in it. People who had given up, people who felt like they were running out of time, people who needed a reminder that their voice, their talent, their story still mattered. With that thought, he took a slow breath and walked on, knowing the world was full of small moments waiting to become turning points. And as this story closes, 2 questions remain for anyone listening. Have you ever seen someone regain their confidence because one person believed in them? What story would you like to see? Keanu Reeves in next.